they view the Israelis as being, capable of doing a lot of things for themselves in a way that they do not view Europe as currently being capable of doing it, or eager to do it, or, in some cases, even willing to do it.
Hello and welcome to the Americano Show. Today we are going to be talking about the extraordinary Signal Principles Committee national security story that broke yesterday. For viewers that don't know, this is about Jeffrey Goldberg, who is editor of The Atlantic, and he wrote a mind-blowing, jaw-dropping, extraordinary story that was published yesterday about how he was added to a signal group on which there were J.D. Vance, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, essentially all the most important people in the Trump administration, apart from Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, I should add, Director of Intelligence, to a group. This group was discussing the bombing of the Houthis. Jeffrey Goldberg thought it was probably a prank. Jeffrey Goldberg, I should say, who is a long-term critic, almost an obsessive critic at times of the Trump administration. And yet it seems the story is real. There's quite a lot to unpack from it. So I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Domenech, who is the Spectator's editor-at-large. And we should start, Ben, by saying, how do you think this actually happened? Do you believe that it was just an accidental ad that Mike Waltz, who I didn't mention, who I should have mentioned in that introduction, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, added Jeffrey Goldberg? Was it just by accident? It seems to have been.
It certainly seems to have been. And Freddie, I think that we're still in the early days of this, and what we're going to see in the coming days is that Congress is going to have a lot of questions following up on how this happened, where we're probably going to learn more. But the early going certainly does seem to indicate that this was just a massive screw up on the part of Mike Waltz. And I want to take a step back because for our listeners who are not familiar with the background of some of the people that we're talking about, or who are only, early on coming to know who they are, one thing to keep in mind is that Mike Waltz is, at least in the context of Washington, D.C., viewed as perhaps the least controversial and most trusted in terms of Capitol Hill guy who is the part of this team, perhaps other than Senator Marco Rubio, meaning that when it came to the foreign policy team that President Trump built, there were questions about Pete Hegseth, there were questions about Tulsi Gabbard, there were questions about others who were going to be part of the team at different levels and have different responsibilities, but very few people had any issues with Mike Waltz, and they viewed him as someone who's very trustworthy, just given his background. He's 50 years old. He's a veteran of the war on terror. He's, a lauded sort of guy, a foreign policy expert on Capitol Hill. And because of that, the fact that it seems to have been his screw up here surprises a lot of people. However, I will give you a little bit of background information myself, which is that Mike Waltz is someone who does talk quite freely to a lot of journalists. I'm not alone in having this opinion of him. In fact, the last time I saw him, I asked for his new number when he was going into the admin, because I figured that at some point we would talk. We haven't texted since then, so I don't think I'm going to be. I would not expect his number to be the same going forward. But the point is just this: he is someone who's viewed with a lot of respect, and so for him to screw up in this way, as it seems to be on the surface, is something that I think comes as a surprise to a lot of people. There's already been a quote from the new senator from Montana, Tim Sheehy, to the extent of saying, well, someone effed up. And that's clearly going to be a line of pursuit in terms of conversations with Tulsi Gabbard on Capitol Hill, as well as John Ratcliffe, the new head of the CIA. And that's something that I think is really the first incident that we've had in this administration of the White House itself screwing up, meaning we've had some screw ups that have happened on other levels, either by DOJ or by, I think in particular, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has been viewed as having made some mistakes in terms of her early going here. But the White House itself really did not have the equivalent of something like what happened with the so-called Muslim ban that was Steve Bannon's baby back in the first administration, where they had a screw up right off the bat, stumbled over themselves, etc. This is really the first one of significance. And while it does seem that there were not, perhaps, full-on war plans or something like that leaked, the information that came out did come out before these strikes happened. Jeffrey Goldberg, to I think his credit, actually sat on it. But then also the fact that he was added in the first place has to be questioned, and also why they were using something, even something that is, respected as an encrypted conversational aspect signal, to go back and forth on this. I think that the Congress is going to have a ton of questions about what happened, and we're going to see them pursue that in the coming days.
And indeed, you mentioned Mike Waltz being somebody who talks to journalists, but the fact that he clearly has talked to Jeffrey Goldberg in the past might raise some suspicions within Trump world, because, of course, Jeffrey Goldberg is the author of the, some think, highly dubious story about Donald Trump refusing to visit a cemetery. I think it was back in 2019. The very fact that he is seems to be on texting terms with Jeffrey Goldberg is itself a sign for some people in Trump world that he is a figure who should be treated with suspicion.
I certainly think you're correct about that, Freddie. And one of the things to keep in mind about that story, of course, is that, and I still do view that story as very dubious. One of the reasons that I do, along with many others in Washington, even those who are Trump critics, is that John Bolton, who was supposed to have been a witness or present during that entire process, and who himself is, of course, an enormous critic of the president, himself came out and said that that this was not true, that this was not something that happened. Goldberg, of course, has stuck to his guns, claimed that this suckers and losers comment is something that happened. But I think that there are a lot of us within the DC journalism cohort who view it with a good degree of suspicion, simply because there were so many people who don't like the president anyway, who came out and said it didn't happen. But Goldberg, and this is something to keep in mind, this is not just someone who is a critic of the president. This is one of the most prominent critics of the president. This is someone who, put a cover story together in the Atlantic magazine, essentially warning the country against the horrible nature of reelecting Donald Trump, repeatedly, employing people who've gone after him in so many different respects. And so the idea that Mike Waltz would just accidentally add him to a list came as somewhat of a surprise. Now, there have been theories advanced, including by Emily Jashinsky over at Unheard, who has noted that there are a couple possibilities here, but one includes the possibility that there is another figure within the government who might have shared the same initials with Jeffrey Goldberg, and that perhaps that was who Mike Waltz was seeking to add. But one thing that I do find amusing about this is that behind the scenes, the people in question do seem to be very legitimate in the sense that Waltz is the most hawkish of those having this conversation. You have kind of Pete Hegseth a little bit in the middle, and you have J.D. Vance being the most concerned about the ramifications of these strikes, and if they would lead to the United States being sucked into a larger conflict. And so, to be honest, on a certain level, there's an amusement factor here, in addition to the serious security concerns, that is one of the reasons that all of Washington is talking about this and has been sharing memes and jokes and that kind of thing behind the scenes, because it is just one of the bizarre moments that we've seen play out in the Trump era. It's just to such a heightened degree because it includes so many different participants from the foreign policy and national security sphere.
It is amazingly hilarious in several ways. I mean, I heard somebody say, I think I read it on X, that this is a bit like Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor to Joe Biden, looping in Tucker Carlson into a text chain. It's the worst possible person they could have.
Yes, the point is that you didn't add someone to it who was, a parent at your kid's school, or someone, like there's so many other people you could have added where it would have been embarrassing, but it would not have been someone who is such a prominent critic. And the fact that it is just is something that gives fuel to this and creates, I think, a whole conversation around this that at the staff level, at least, is an item of amusement. But I will say this: the president and his team, really ran against Joe Biden and against Hillary Clinton before that, based on arguments around security that they certainly used against them quite frequently. You know, obviously, the most recent example of this is that in the wake of that Mar-a-Lago raid, where we found that the former president had taken so many different boxes of material, including questionable material, whether it was classified or the like, that he had taken out of the White House and had in potentially non-secure ways within his Mar-a-Lago home. That was obviously an aspect that then led to us discovering that Joe Biden had an equivalent problem, that he had been storing things within his own garage that were unacceptable. He did assure us that he locked the garage quite a lot. So, but the thing that is interesting is to go from Hillary Clinton having her email server to the argument about those documents to something like this. It overall indicates, I think, to the American people that we have a real problem when it comes to security, operational security at the highest levels within government, that hasn't gone away even with this new administration. And while there were certainly concerns about that in the last administration, I mean, you had Lloyd Austin, for instance, the defense secretary, the Secretary of Defense, and you had other people associated with him who hid the fact that he basically was disappeared because of medical issues for quite some time. This is something that I think is a continual problem. And in this era, when so many people are so loosey-goosey when it comes to the way that they talk about things, so willing to use some of these quote-unquote secure apps of sometimes dubious security to communicate with each other, that it creates opportunities for America's enemies to use this information against them in very negative and dangerous ways. That didn't obviously happen in the case of these strikes, but it certainly could have.
Well, you referred to it there a bit earlier, but let's talk about the substance of the conversations on those messages that we have seen, because we haven't seen all of it. Jeffrey Goldberg reserved some of it. But it seems to me that Speaker Mike Johnson has tried to defend the story. While obviously all Republicans, I think, are a little embarrassed by this story. Mike Johnson said, actually, you can see a cohesive team working together, and I've heard other people say similar things. There does seem to be a sort of an agreement of purpose, but there is this interesting digression where J.D. Vance, the vice president, says he's not sure the president is entirely aware, I think is the word he used, maybe I got it wrong, of how this looks. Because of the Europe that the message we're trying to put across, the America First message we're trying to put across about Europe, because Europe gets 40% of its trade through the Suez Canal, which is near where they were bombing the Houthis, and America only gets 3%. So essentially, America is, to use Vance's word, bailing out Europe again. Yes. And Pete Hegseth says, yes, it's pathetic in capital letters. That clearly shows the way they're thinking about foreign policy. What did you read into that?
No, I think you're completely right to highlight that portion, because it's one of the areas where I think we can gather a bit more about their thinking than we had before we had this information. And though it is consistent with what I think a lot of us have believed, which is that they simply do not view the Europeans as being equal partners in this effort, and they view them as being a long way away from being capable of being the kind of partners that they would like them to be. Meaning that, this is something where they feel like this is not a problem that America necessarily should have to solve for the sake of their European allies. And I think that, Hegseth sort of indicates that he's aligned himself a little bit more with the J.D. Vance critique of Europe within that context, as opposed to perhaps the more traditional Republican view of America's role in the world. Now, whether that's something that extends out to other areas of policy as well, areas that are, at least from my perspective, far more important than the Houthis, that's something that I think is still an open question. But it does, I think, provide some insight into, the different alignments that people are pursuing within this administration. This is a group of people who I truly believe represent the spectrum on the right of the differences on foreign policy and national security in a way that is indicative of where people actually are, meaning that you have a Republican coalition where there are people who are still kind of in each of these different lanes. And while perhaps the most neoconservative members of the Republican cohort have been banished or self-deported themselves into the Democratic coalition, they still have, some remnants of people who have different opinions about foreign policy going forward that could play a role within this agenda. And one thing that could come quite frankly, from this moment is, and this is something that members of Congress are mindful of, and certainly those in Washington who pay attention to it are mindful of, is that if Mike Waltz ends up being the person who suffers because of this, in terms of whether I don't actually think he's going to be pushed out. That's my own feeling at the moment after talking to several people. But I do think that this does hurt him within this White House. And it could mean to his voice being listened to less within the room. And that's something that has potential impacts on foreign policy and national security. We've seen lesser offenses sideline people within Trump world. And this one is certainly the first, as I said, major screw up to come in this White House. And it comes from someone who not a lot of people thought of as being a screw up beforehand.
Mm. And wounded Europeans may be feeling a bit miffed about it. There's another country, of course, that is involved in this story, which is Israel. And Hegseth even at one point mentions Israel and says if we don't do it, Israel are going to do, as in if we don't strike the Houthis, Israel are going to do it first. And so the conclusion of that is that American First agenda is very willing to help Israel if it serves America's interests. And Europe is out of favor, but Middle Eastern allies are more important to the foreign policy agenda than European allies, arguably.
I think that's 100% true. And I don't think there's any indication otherwise. The truth is that they simply don't, they view the Israelis as being, capable of doing a lot of things for themselves in a way that they do not view Europe as currently being capable of doing it or eager to do it, or, in some cases even willing to do it. And that's, a real difference in terms of the alliance. Look, this moves in both directions. The way that this is depicted often in the conversation within the press and among people of the cast of characters alongside Jeffrey Goldberg, who, by the way, just a few weeks ago was participating in another breaking of norms within Washington, D.C., which was the weaponization of the Gridiron Club dinner, which used to be one of the rare moments of bipartisanship in the city, in a comedy routine that was just outright attacking the president and Elon Musk and others in a way that was viewed as being quite gauche among the DC set, basically invading something that was one of the last vestiges of bipartisan norms and treating it as partisan. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that I expect that this upcoming next month White House Correspondents' Dinner to be one that is perhaps one of the least attended by anybody who is not on the left in Washington, simply because there is no longer, after all the different steps that the White House has taken against the Associated Press and other members of the Washington press bureaus, there is no longer really any kind of sentiment where this is a place where Republicans and Democrats can come to meet together. But it's very interesting to me that the way that this is going to be depicted is Washington's current foreign policy and national security leadership moving away from Europe, when I think in reality this is something of a mutual activity, that this is them kind of identifying something that they think was already going on. And that they believe that the Europeans have not lived up to their promises, that they have not delivered on the kind of investments needed in order to make sure that there is the type of military presence here that is needed. Now, I have my own opinions about that, but that's certainly the opinions of this administration. And I think that this text chain is just one more indication of it.
Lastly, Ben, there's J.D. Vance. The insight into J.D. Vance is quite interesting because at one level, you see that the rest of the group seem to be eager to agree with him. Hegseth says agree, VP agree in response to him a couple of times, I think, as do others. They say we share your concern. But the second point is that he had this concern that the president was not really in the loop as to what was going on. Donald Trump, I think it's fair to say, won't like that being public. And J.D. Vance's spokesman yesterday was very keen to say the president and the vice president have spoken about this. They're aligned on foreign policy and so on. But that is the story is pretty bad for J.D. Vance in some ways, isn't it?
Well, I think yes, but less so. But I think that it's one of these things where it's more about one of the things that is really interesting about this, and I don't mean to go long with a final question, but one of the things that's really interesting about all of these disputes is that everyone represents themselves as representing the interests of the president, meaning I am representing the president when I'm making this argument for this thing that I think, okay? And that is often of dubious nature in terms of what the president has actually said. I personally believe that this is intentional on the president's part, because I think he likes to see people go back and forth, take different sides of a different issue. He's more subtle than people, I think, give him credit for when it comes to a lot of the indications that he gives. And a lot of the time, you have to prove yourself in terms of making a bet that the president is going to side with you in a key moment. And if he doesn't, then you'll be out of a job. And one of the things that is indicated by this conversation that I think we have back and forth is that J.D. Vance is internally making the argument that he represents what the president wants. He is pursuing the president's foreign policy. And the subtle implication there, of course, is that there are others within the admin who may or may not be as closely aligned. Now, I think there are a lot of critics of J.D. Vance who would say, actually, he is not in exactly the same lane as the president. The president is himself more hawkish, certainly more willing to use military power in the past, and perhaps more willing to use it than J.D. Vance is currently in the moment. And so that's something that we're still figuring out. You know, the foreign policy, like I said, has a spectrum of different people with different beliefs, including beliefs about central aspects of intelligence policy and the like, not just power projection. And what I think a lot of us are waiting for is, you know, how aggressive does the president want to be in certain aspects of this? One example that I'll give you that is not, of course, talked about in this conversation is the relationship that the United States currently has with Mexico. You know, there was a lot of back and forth internally about, you know, does the president really want to name these various cartels as being foreign terror organizations, something that Mike Waltz has spearheaded and that I think Marco Rubio is certainly in favor of. You know, but at the same time, you know, there's differences of opinion about whether, you know, what the ramifications of doing that would be. And certainly there are people who had concerns that this would lead to a real conflict with Mexico that could spill over into so many different ways. So we're still in the early going of this administration, and we're still figuring out what areas are, you know, of the biggest priority within these foreign policy decisions and national security decisions are ones where each of these different figures is most closely aligned with the president, and ones where they might be not quite aligned in terms of their priorities or in terms of how much force they are willing to deploy.
Yes, we need to get somebody needs to be added to the PC signals group on Mexico.
Yes, and if someone wants to do that with me, I'm happy to lurk in the background for a while.
Ben Domenech, thank you very much for coming on to Americano.
Great to be with you.